All right, this is the recap of your lessons on Tuesday, the 25th of February, Everyday Math, and this is for Section 1, but I'm sending it again to both sections so that you can learn from each other. There were some common themes. Common themes are kind of like patterns. Notice the XOXOXO pattern at the bottom. There are patterns that occur in each of the teaching groups, and so I looked for those patterns, those common themes, and this is what I'll address in this particular video. The three things that I noticed in section 1 of your math lessons is I'd like to talk about fractional language, I'd like to talk about improving worksheets, and I'd like to talk about changing the rules on games that you use in the classroom. So the first topic is fractional language. When you use the term 3 out of 4, that sounds like whole numbers. And so kids take what they hear and they think in whole numbers when they hear the term 3 out of 4. Now 3 out of 4 is a correct way of naming the numeral that you see on the left, but it's adult understanding that 3 out of 4 means 3/4. So when kids hear whole numbers, they think whole numbers, and we don't want them to think whole numbers when we're teaching them fractions. We want to have them think in fractions. So rather than use whole number terms to describe fractions, we use fractional terms to describe fractions when we're teaching them. So we use the term 3/4. 3/4 doesn't sound like two different whole numbers. It sounds like something completely different. It sounds like a term that's been blended together somehow and is a new word. And that's what we're striving for, is for kids to be able to hear fractional language. So when you're teaching fractions, please try to use fractional language instead of whole number language for clarity. You'll note that if we put 3/4 on a number line, the one on the left, well, 3/4 is, let me back up for a minute because I'm obviously out of whack. Okay, so 3/4 doesn't sound like whole numbers, it sounds like something different, and it is something different. A fraction typically appears between whole numbers, and whole numbers typically appear at the major stopping points on a number line. So we want kids to get the idea that a fraction appears at a different place on a number line than a whole number would, most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. So if we look at the pizza on the left, we've got 3/4, and we've got 3 out of 4 on the fraction on the right, but 3/4 still has its place on the number line right before 1, whereas if we look at 3 out of 4, as a child I'm thinking, where does that, 3 out of 4, where does that belong? Does that belong at the 3 before the 4 or a little bit before the 4? Because it's whole number language. So again, emphasize fractional language rather than whole number language. Okay, second topic was worksheets. Worksheets are boring, they're not very engaging, they tend to be abstract, and yet they're found in every publisher. And they do that because they want to make it easy on the teachers. They're not necessarily doing it because it's what's best for kids. Remember, they want to sell a product, and they're more likely to sell a product if they can convince the teachers that something is going to make their life easier. So what can we do about worksheets? Well, we could eliminate them, but it's possible that we would also be eliminating some pretty important practice. So how about instead of eliminating them, if we improve them? Kids need not boring, they need to be engaged, they need more concrete and semi-concrete instead of abstract, and worksheets tend to be abstract. So what can we do to make worksheets so that they're not boring and more engaging and not abstract? How can we make them less boring, less abstract, and more engaging? That's a question we have to ask ourselves repeatedly as teachers. Well, you can rebuild them, you can adapt them, you can repurpose them, and let me give you some ideas on that. I saw some in action today. You can layer construction paper on top. So here, instead of cutting or instead of coloring on the worksheet, the students were cutting out pieces and gluing them on top, and that automatically takes it to a semi-concrete level, makes it less boring, more engaging, less abstract, more semi-concrete. So it's accomplished the purpose that we want in rebuilding a worksheet. Another thing I saw today was to use different colors. Sometimes that's all you've got time for. You don't have time to cut things out ahead of time. But using different colors will put a different emphasis on the worksheet. I'm always struck by when I used to teach on holidays, I would simply take some of the worksheets that we had to do because they were part of our program, and I ran them off on colored paper instead of white paper, and the kids thought they died and gone to heaven because they were working on a pink worksheet or a green worksheet instead of a white worksheet. So small things make kids happy and engage them and make the work less boring. You can transfer the concept to something else, and in this particular lesson, this ingenious use of plastic paper plates as whiteboards. So we've got the paper plate, we've got the old t-shirt as a wipe, we've got the expo marker, and then instead of having the kids complete the worksheet, you can challenge them to draw, just by coincidence, the exact same things that are on the worksheet. Voila! And now we've transformed a worksheet into a completely engaging experience, and they can clean their own whiteboards. And what a great idea, and how cheap can you get? I mean, this is just an amazing idea for teaching and involving everybody and engaging everyone. I want to talk about games. Feel free to change the rules of the game when you're teaching a game. You probably recognize this game because I think most of you played it in your groups, and it was a game where it was played kind of like Fraction War, where you had to determine which of the fractions were bigger. And on one side there was the abstract fraction, the number without the drawing. On the other side was the drawing. So what I would challenge you to do is when you have a game, see if you can play it at more concrete levels first. So for example, with this game, you could play it pictures only the first time around, and then the second round that you play it, play Prove It, where they have to give the abstract, but then they have to prove their thinking by showing the picture. And then the third time around, you could do it numbers only. A lot of times I'll introduce games to kids where I'll say, okay, this time we're going to play pictures only, and you've got 2 minutes to play pictures only, and then I'm going to interrupt you and change the rules. And kids actually like that. They like it as the game, to have the game grow harder. I was telling one of the groups yesterday that I used to teach kindergarten and first grade how to play chess, and I'd buy enough chess games so that every student could play at the same time with a partner. And I started out at the beginning of the year in October by teaching them a game of pawns. We would put the pawns on the board exactly where they go, and then I would teach them exactly the way the pawns move, but nothing else would be there, just the pawns. And then when they got pawns down and they could play a successful game with pawns, then I would add the rooks, and we'd play a game of pawns and rooks. And then later on we'd play pawns, rooks, and knights. And by the end of the year, most years, all my students knew how to play chess, and that was a real saver for me for rainy day recesses, because they liked it. And they thought they were so smart because they knew how to play chess and the fifth graders didn't. But I did that by changing the rules of the game and making them gradually harder and more abstract. You could also, in terms of games, you could differentiate, use a game as a differentiation activity. After you've covered a concept, then you could divide into groups and have each group play a different version of the game, where some people would be playing an easier version at their level of needed reinforcement, and other groups would be playing a harder version at their level of challenge. Okay, I saw some great moments today, and I saw them in both groups. I got a little better about getting a video together, I think, for this group and making it a little more exciting and maybe more effective. So I'd like to share some great moments I saw today. First of all, I saw that students were doing. You had your students up and they were involved. There was a buzz around the room as people got up, and they were measuring, and they were playing games, and they were touching manipulatives, and that is precisely what I want to see in your teaching. Secondly, I saw some really effective use of visuals, creative use of visuals, and I saw that again and again in the different lessons. I saw the standards posted. I saw the standards posted as I can standards. I saw the standards written out and choral read by the students, and those are all really good strategies. Let me tell you, when a teacher stands up at the front of the room and reads the standard and has no visual, the standard means nothing. But when there's an I can standard or visuals in place and the kids can see the words and dissect the words and talk about the words, you get a lot of bang for your buck by starting a lesson with the standards every day. And it's one of the things that we know is an effective strategy that gives us more learning by the students. So I do want to see standards being introduced at the beginning of your lesson in a meaningful way. I saw writing across the curriculum. This was a great activity where at the end of the lesson the students were asked to think of something that might be too difficult to measure in feet because it is either too big or too small, and then draw a picture of that and think of a way it might be easier to measure it, draw a picture, explain it at the bottom. This is like the ultimate lesson, to be able to have some sort of higher level thinking problem at the end where students have to apply the knowledge that they've learned, and they have to draw a picture, and they have to write. We've got both sides of the brain accessed with that one, the right brain for the drawing, left brain for the language. And an activity like this is absolutely phenomenal for formative assessment. When you look back at what your students have written and drawn, you really know who got it and who didn't. So a great moment in today's lesson. I saw student-generated charts instead of worksheets. And again, wonderful idea to take the ideas from the worksheets, but then have the students generate the chart instead of doing something on a pre-published worksheet. The students who learn how to generate charts when they're young will turn to generating charts to solve life's problems. Now think about that in the reverse. If students spend their life doing worksheets and they encounter a life problem, where are they going to get the worksheet to solve that problem? You know, but if they've figured out how to draw charts and make pictures and make tables, then they've got the tools they need to solve life problems. I saw some extremely nice, kid-friendly, effective manipulatives, some good enough to eat. And this particular set was particularly effective, not only because it looks so wonderful, but it would be really easy to store, and this would be something that you could probably use over time, maybe even for 30 years of teaching, because they've been constructed so sturdily. I saw Realia. Now Realia is great for ELL. Why use a paper apple if you can use a real apple? And that's what Realia is all about, is using real items instead of paper representations or drawings. And again, it's great for ELL students to be able to use Realia. I saw vocabulary being introduced, and not only was it being introduced, but it was being introduced in words, visuals, using visuals with the words big enough for the students to read, and it was being taught explicitly, it was being reinforced, and my big thrill is I saw people returning to the vocabulary that they introduced again and again during the lesson. So it's not enough to just introduce the words at the beginning. You have to be able to return to it. And sometimes that sounds funny to us as teachers, to return to the same vocabulary word 20 times in a lesson, but that's exactly what kids need in order to pick up content and academic vocabulary. I saw active engagement with students touching, cutting, building, pasting, measuring, lots of active engagement today. So all over, for a first lesson, I thought it was extremely effective teaching. I look forward to seeing more of the same, and your own creativity built in on how you can even make the good better. So we'll look for that on Thursday.